when Trump was president. It's so funny that was 20 years ago. We've made so much progress since then. We cured measles for the second time, reduced global poverty, and finally made it possible to live around here without a freaking car. Back in 2019, traffic sucked, but who wanted to wait for a bus that only comes once an hour? Boulder's walking, biking, and transit infrastructure was way better than many American cities. But sadly, that's not saying much. It was still designed for cars as the default, not for people. Back then, we lost 90,000 lives in the US every year to car crashes and pollution. 90,000. That's like losing the entire population of Longmont every year. And yet, nobody talked about it. We rightfully talked about gun violence, but we didn't talk about the #1 killer of kids. This was a crisis, but it was also just a part of life. We thought of cars as freedom, but that was only true for some. People with disabilities and the elderly were disproportionately affected by an inability to drive, like my mom. In 2000, she suffered a stroke and had to stop driving, but our town required a car to get around. I was 13 and I was frustrated. How was I supposed to get to friends' houses? What I didn't fully comprehend back then was that for people like my mom, this meant social isolation and feeling like a burden on others. I wish that my mom could have had the infrastructure then that we have now in 2040. In 2019, people who couldn't afford a car were more likely to be impacted by shoddy transit and air pollution. Our system, which is built for convenience, screwed over the very people who needed it the most. And we had the data. Over and over, studies connected our car-dependent culture to obesity, asthma, less social interaction, but we'd adapted. And so it stayed like this for decades. And it's not surprising, given how ingrained it was in our culture. Way back in 1956, the interstate highway system was started. Eisenhower promised that it would eliminate traffic jams and allow people to quickly get out of cities in the case of an atomic attack. It connected the country together with wide roads to travel more places, but it also displaced residents and businesses and ripped apart communities. This enforced decades of auto and gasoline subsidies. These subsidies and a lack of investment in public transit led to our sprawling suburbs, which further forced car dependence. Well, that sucked, but at least our laws protected us when we were outside of our cars, right? Nope. Our laws subsidized driving too. Fun fact, the auto industry created the term jaywalking and then lobbied for laws around it. Speed limits and walk signals were not designed for our safety, but for maximizing car throughput. And even parts of Europe were having the car forced upon them as their only option for moving around. Pictures of Rotterdam, Netherlands in the 1950s show a car-centric design. And they then spent the end of the 20th century reversing the damage. Separated bike paths, inviting sidewalks, a tram that doesn't have to sit in traffic. And meanwhile in the US, we were doubling down on car infrastructure. Some said that electric self-driving cars would save us, but they didn't work everywhere. They were still cars. We realized they would still pollute our air, increase the number of vehicles, and isolate us. But finally, in the 2020s, things started to change. We embraced that community meant all of us, and not just each of us. And this change wasn't easy, and it was sometimes uncomfortable. It required shifting our culture and changing how we use land. We knew that bikes in transit were a lot more space efficient than cars, but what was amazing was what that space became. This was an investment, but in the end, we actually saved money. And this happened because we demanded that it be treated as the crisis it was, and we started designing for people, not just for cars. And we finally got the more vibrant, healthy, and inclusive cities that we have today.